Hello, so today I'm going to talk about chapters 12 and 14 in UK politics. And chapter 12 is about pressure groups and how they affect UK politics. Chapter 14 goes into the concept of devolution, that has been a recent concept that has still grown in the UK in recent years. So pressure groups have always been around, and the welfare state era has especially seen a growth in them in the UK. So most pressure groups are divided by sectional and causal groups, as they represent the section or they represent the cause that they are fighting for. Pressure groups will often challenge each other, influence others, or even join alliances together. So pressure groups have been a political cure for the bullying alone phenomenon by the scholar Putnam as a way of bringing people together for common values in a political democratic context, with protest movements having been a popular outlet in recent times for this. So pressure groups can provide support or rejection of policy and gives political policy legitimacy through them, especially when they are approved by these pressure groups. So pressure groups are dividable also as either insider groups, those consulted by government, and outsiders who don't have the same type of access with government. So many groups want to be on the insider status, except for the few outsider ones who aim to be at odds with the government. But those insider status ones tend to meet a criteria. They must follow the rules, they must stay out of the limelight. So outsiders sometimes succeed by winning public sympathy by not needing government, but in a way we can almost say that insiders are succeeding by getting inside the government in a way. So there's no fine line between being an insider or an outsider group. And although most pressure groups tend to be more peaceful, there have been some noteworthy violent ones that have been in history. So sustaining attention of government is a critical thing that pressure groups must do, as pressure groups need to frame their causes appropriately to their favor. Even after becoming first known, they must consistently make their cause relevant. So pressure groups will aim to influence parliament, the media, the public, and all that is in between. So pressure groups, especially lobbying ones, have been linked to the revolving door phenomenon of politicians scoring jobs with certain groups after leaving their post, and links with work in the privatized field have accelerated, especially in the post-Thatcher years, that those of before used to find as an inappropriate link between government and the private sector, but it is now being considered, at least by a lot of more right-wing groups, as a healthy balance and in a way even democratic. So there have been policies to prevent this, but they are weakly enforced, including the 2014 Statutory Register of Professional Lobbyists, which has been accused of shortcomings in correctly identifying lobbyists. So these groups, the pressure groups, have their own elaborative systems as well, and the best ones aim to act like a business, and they follow through with issues in the attention cycle also to remain relevant, as I said. And even some businesses who do have resources will still find themselves struggling to succeed with their ideas if they don't match in government, as was seen in the May and Johnson administrations during the Brexit time. So trade unions used to have a stronger historical sway as pressure groups. That was until Thatcher, but during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party up until about the COVID pandemic, there has been a revival in their influence. And it's a bit too early to determine fully, but their power now seems to be at a waning, as it hasn't maintained the same momentum as it did up to the COVID years. So the pluralist theory is also not a popular theory to describe the pressure groups, as they have shown more power is given to pressure groups' interests, which are not proportionately for all citizens of a country. The Marxist theory claims that pressure groups are essentially a facade of hegemonic control. And under Thatcher and the neoliberals, their beliefs also were that pressure groups were also seen as too privileged in government, who they saw as not representing the British public sector accurately. So the next chapter goes into devolution. So nationalism is such a nuanced topic, as we've already discussed before, in the UK, as the British nation often comes at odds with the national identities of Wales and Scotland. And even the term nationalist group is sometimes not even used in this context because of its association with right-wing nationalism. So in the 60s, when devolutionary efforts won in Scotland and Wales, the fear of independence from UK's Labour Party set up the Kilbrandon Commission to examine the issue of devolution, which was ignored once the Conservatives came into power soon after. But when Labour returned in the 70s, Prime Minister James Callaghan dealt with, and he held a referendum on this issue, which actually lost, and eventually lost Labour a vote of no confidence soon after. Thatcher didn't put too much attention in this issue. However, she did appoint some ministers towards the devolutionary regions, at least before they were called devolved regions. But by the 90s, with Tony Blair, he finally instituted the devolutionary efforts that we know them and seen them to be in giving these regions more autonomy. So the chapter eventually goes into the three big devolved nations in this region, and starts off with Northern Ireland. Now, this is a region that is a reminder of Britain's intolerant past of the nationalists who have based their identities on the Catholic identity, which has been a group that has been neglected compared to the Protestant group, which is an identity that many Protestants in the region associate with the Unionist identity. Now, these two divisions between Protestants, Catholics, of Unionists, nationalists, they still remain prominent today. Since Northern Ireland was established in 1922, a segregated society between the Catholics and the Protestants has been a seriously challenged issue throughout this time, up until the 70s when the Troubles, which was a violent uprising against the Protestant, the name is Royal Ulster Constabulary, which was the dominant power of the Unionists in Northern Ireland. And paramilitary organizations, including the Irish Republican Army, revolted against this group, and many violent uprisings occurred during the 70s in this time. By 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed and created Northern Ireland's Assembly, which violence is stopped since then, but there is still potential to erupt, and it's not fair to say that it will never happen again, actually. So the DUP, which is the Democratic Unionist Party, and Sinn Féin, which is the more on the nationalist party of Northern Ireland Irish politics, soon became the dominant unionist and nationalist parties. And both were actually quite radical over time and become more radical on their own sides. So by 2006, the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, was disbanded, and a year later, the two main parties started to see a coming together of Sinn Féin and the DUP, and with the incentive of extra funding from Blair's government. And these two actually got along well in government for some time. Now, there were some big scandals, including the Ash for Cash from the DUP and the controversial Irish Language Act from Sinn Féin, that saw a breakdown in these relations and saw the assembly struggle to function by the late 20-teens, well, up until the late 20-teens. The Northern Ireland Act of 2019 was passed in Westminster, the main part of the UK, to continue the functioning of government during this turmoil. Now, since 2024, it's been looking positive and it's kind of functioning well, so there's not too much concern there. Scotland. Now, this has been a relatively smooth transition into the UK since its incorporation back in the Act of Union 1707, and it has been respected by England and the region has been respected in its autonomy by England even up until World War II, including the Scottish Secretary post in London. So by the late 20th century, independence became popular, and Thatcher's Scottish secretaries started to provide support, were supportive of the call for its own parliament. So Labour by 97, its win enabled a parliament referendum for Scotland, which succeeded, and Scotland saw its first elections in 1999. So the SCC, the Scottish Constituent, forgetting the name, but the similar one, basically, yes, the body that was trying to make the constitution for Scotland made a proportional system so that Labour didn't maintain a hegemony in power and see coalitions become necessary in this case. And many of these coalitions were the Labour and the Liberal Democrats in the Scottish Parliament. So the Scottish National Party, but which was becoming a more popular party, won the 2007 elections, and having no one willing to work with them because of their pro-independence stance, had struggled with a minority government at the time. By 2007, they did cement their power, and Conservatives became a new opposition to them rather than the traditional Labour and Liberal Democrats. So they lost the 2016 elections, but as the Scottish National Party backed away from the issue of Brexit, even Conservatives in the region came to agreement with them on a soft Brexit approach. The 2014 referendum on the Scottish independence that was held with the SNP on the pro side and basically all the other parties on the opposite side was rejected, and though it was believed to have put the issue to rest of Scottish independence for some time, but the SNP made a comeback during COVID, and the issue seems possible to come up again of Scottish independence. So Wales was also another region that was easily integrated into England, with the Principality of Wales being nearly 800 years old in its connection with England. So nationalism in the late 19th century with Plaid Cymru was not too popular in the main parties, but Welsh Labour eventually got Wilson, the Prime Minister of the time, to give his Welsh secretary role. So Plaid Cymru's 1966 win with Gwenhwyfar Evans began to threaten Labour in the nation, which was in part why the Kilbrandon Commission was also set up to resolve this issue. By the 1997 elections, so Labour became committed to establishing a Welsh Assembly, and it was a weak start in government for the Welsh Assembly. It didn't have a primary legislation authority, but only the power to amend secondary legislation, but wasn't attempted to be fixed until the Richard Commission, and it wasn't until 2011 that the referendum to give the Welsh Assembly primary legislation authority was finally passed. So issues in education arose between the Welsh government and Westminster over education because the Conservatives in Westminster and Labour in Wales were on opposite sides of what they would do for education in the region of Wales specifically. So Labour, although never having one full majority since the Welsh Assembly's inception, the region has been seen that this is almost a concentrated power that acts almost as a one-party state, as Plaid Cymru support has been on the decline for a while and continues to not be the most popular. The 2016 elections saw a shift towards the right, as the region was the only devolved region to vote in favor of the Brexit vote. By 2019, Conservatives were doing a better job here, and Plaid Cymru was being nowhere near the same influence as somewhere like the SNP in Scotland and its independent support. So following Brexit, all devolved nations aimed to have a seat at the negotiation table, and they were aimed to be brought to have their concerns heard, but many didn't feel like they were being heard. The rejection of Johnson's Brexit agenda was essentially ignored to some nations, and many of these devolved nations began to feel that Brexit was a precedent of the UK government taking primacy over the devolved nations and their own matters. So English regionalism has also been a tackled subject, with back to Prime Minister Wilson's creation of bodies to handle this matter, but some of the efforts were scrapped by Thatcher to maintain central power. However, EU reforms by the 90s compelled the government to actually take advantage of these structural funds that the EU was offering in economic assistance, and this was furthered once Labour came to power with the development of the RCs, which are once Labour came into power, and the development of the regional chambers, I mean to say. But it was an intended slow process to give all the English regions devolved powers, as they weren't trying to give it all at once. So beginning first with the Northeast in the UK and England, with a referendum vote that failed because of a high popularity, even from both major parties. Yet there remained strong demand for some form of English devolution to match those of the other devolved nations. but has no clear popular answer to resolve this issue. Yet there remain strong demands for, but conservatives by 2015 showed a goal in trying to give devolved England cities outside of the Southeast some more power for themselves. And this has been a cause that Labour has also been catching up on. And especially from the aftermath of Brexit and COVID, devolution shows itself as more apparent in its laws and relations with the rest of the UK and all these devolved nations, and seeing how each of these regions vary in their relationship with the central government in Westminster. So pressure groups' ambiguous status as organizations that pressure for specific policies in government are of course not entirely popular bodies for many people. But what I think can be widely agreed is that in some sense, they are democratic in their nature. Now, this is regardless of how little or disproportionately high on resources and financial support that they might have in swaying politics. So this is perhaps my American perspective and how I see it, in that in a democracy such as ours in the US, anyone can come from anywhere, regardless of their background, and become something big. And this includes pressure groups who can influence policy and potentially infiltrate government to make it work for their favor. Although it's not necessarily a democratic value you might consider it, it does follow the rules of democracy, it seems. Now from this, it can't entirely be argued that it isn't the actions of the people, in a way, that democracies claim to defend in making government work for them, as this is an essential element in any government, in any democracy. The pluralist approach does have relevance when describing pressure groups, because pressure groups are democracies in action, regardless of whether they are considered grassroots or not. Because although they contain a considerable high level of political power and sway, they are nonetheless formed by non-governmental actors in causes or sections of society that aim for policy implementation. And that's a hard thing to argue against, that that's what pressure groups are aiming to do. Now, I don't aim to defend the perspective of pressure groups are perfectly democratic, no matter how much power they might have, as I explicitly refer to them as wielding a disproportionate level of power for certain groups. But there is a valid argument that they remain within the threshold of a fully functioning democracy. When we consider issues that come from pressure groups or lobbyists' unfair hold on political power, is something like the revolving door phenomenon, where former politicians will work for pressure groups that they supported before. No matter how unjust it is on paper, it does have an unfair advantage to the causes of pressure groups, obviously. That phenomenon does have a valid argument as to the status of being a democratic action that politician might make. This is because the phenomenon is a result of people who come from local causes, like supporting EV vehicles, that have chosen to further implement their causes by acting as virtually independent actors who aim to elevate their cause in government, which in itself fits into the democratic principle of permitting actions for the people by the people. It's of course tainted by their backing of a group that aims to implement these causes with a comparative abundance of resources than does the average citizen who might run for office. But this is just one of the natural outcomes of a democracy in a country like the US or the UK here. Not to mention the revolving door phenomenon, since it is based on not necessarily an explicit link between manipulating government power for pressure group causes. It is difficult criteria to prosecute and try someone for committing this action, when it could be argued, hypothetically, that it was maybe a mere coincidence, or that those who participated in this phenomenon simply enjoyed the cause and wished to further work in their post-government careers. We can also look at this from the point of view of pressure groups running for office, pressure group leaders running for office, and because they genuinely have an interest in wanting to support their cause, which falls under the democratic principle of citizens making the government work for themselves. Now, they are in a way well within their right to run for government regardless of their history. So in this way, it's kind of hard to argue that the reverse can happen, that somebody who was in politics, a high politician, can't somehow go into a position of the sector without looking like they are in the revolving door phenomenon as much as the other. It's just a reverse way. So when I read about how the power pressure groups is seen as sometimes undemocratic, I do take issue with this term undemocratic in this context, because what critics are saying usually in this context is that it is unfair and therefore it must mean undemocratic. Now, these two terms do not always align, we should know. Undemocratic is just such a subjective term in this context, because after all, even the most wealthy pressure group, as long as it does not have direct links with running the government, can still be considered democratic, since it remains within the hands of the people and the private sector in a way. And no matter how privileged these people might be, and this just is in the way the facts of the paper. So what we should pay attention to when someone refers to a specific pressure group as undemocratic is whether they truly see it as not for the general people, or whether they're saying it's not for their people or their community, which then shows a difference in political opinions, trying to guise it as those of others, and that if they are not with their opinions, they therefore go against others. For example, if one considers the NRA in the US, the National Rifle Association, a pressure group with disproportionate power and policy as undemocratic, it will not necessarily be seen in the equivalent manner of gun rights supporters who see the NRA as defending their rights after all. And instead, it just seems to use the word undemocratic in that context as pure politics working against them, which might not be the most effective tool for political debate. So from reading this chapter about the devolution efforts, I find it fascinating that the UK, which once ruled about 25% of the world at its peak, eventually lost its global colonies. And by the 90s, the nations that composed the traditional United Kingdom then attained devolved governments. And now, nations like Scotland are seeking total separation from the UK. So there is an interesting historical pattern here in that the UK continues to lose authority that it once had over faraway regions, and is now losing some of its powers over what had been historically compository nations in the UK. The growing loss of power seems to be contributing to Scotland's push for independence, Northern Ireland's difficulties with the post-Brexit borders between Ireland and the rest of the UK, and even just the Brexit vote itself and how the UK is seeing itself compared to the global field. All these are contributing to this sense of the UK becoming less united than before, it seems. This is also being increasingly seen in how many British citizens are identifying themselves based off of their devolved nation identities, like Scottish or English, or even just by the immigrant backgrounds that they have, like being considered Black British or Asian British. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily a positive or negative thing for the preservation of the UK, but it's a common theme that it's proving itself more and more self-fulfilling to describe what is becoming of the UK since the fall of its peak status as a global superpower by the 20th century. Comparing the devolutionary efforts of the UK with a country like Spain, and more context into the political cultural approaches of these two countries, I think is also a very necessary way we can look at this. So the UK, of course, employed a devolutionary process that has given its region significant autonomy in their own parliaments, and the UK even has a legalized way for independence. Spain, however, has a more unitary government that does allocate autonomous communities to its regions, but for regions that seek further autonomy, like Catalonia, there has been a strong resistance from both sides of the Spanish political aisle against giving them independence. Spain is comparatively less tolerant towards the idea of any type of breakup of the Spanish country, whereas the UK has seen, even from the Conservatives, which is the more right-wing group, a support for devolutionary efforts in self-governance. This might have to do with the fact that the UK had a fresh wave of granting independence within the past century, as we already know, and thus granting autonomy might be a more familiar and adjustable practice to them than compared to the Spanish, which has been held together with little loss of its composition since the formation of the Spanish state in the late 15th century. And it values its united Hispanic culture from the colonies that they had in Latin America, including through incorporating immigrants from Latin American countries, And this is a sentiment that is even shared with some sections of the Spanish far-right anti-immigrant groups as well. I think there is a considerable cultural attitude we should take into account when comparing these two that might explain why the UK has been more friendly to independence compared to the unitary state like Spain. And there is also an element of historical cultural independence we should take into consideration when evaluating British historical culture. And it is that independence and free thought are concepts that the West, and especially the UK, have been a powerhouse in producing, especially from the Renaissance, where free thinkers like John Locke and Adam Smith came from, the UK. The theories that those figures produced, as well as others of free thinking ideas, they were crucial drivers for the independence of countries during the 18th century up into the 19th century, including the United States of America. And the UK has historically, by comparison to continental Europe, been a relatively more independent culture in terms of its freedom of speech and its media autonomy than the rest of continental Europe in its history. Now, I think it's worth considering here that this cultural value of freedom might be a significant factor to take into consideration when evaluating how this value might translate into the devolutionary practices that it has enabled since the late 90s. And it's a possible source for the craving of autonomy that Scotland and Wales have valued in their own devolved governments. Perhaps the UK's historical legacy of being a country that has pushed for freedoms is something that, much like how its colonies took their theories to work in their favor of independence, is now being harnessed by the devolved nations of Scotland and Wales to seek further autonomy for themselves. In this case, I wonder if devolution might eventually establish the sentiment of desiring just full independence from the UK, much as this is happening in Scotland, where there's still a relevant political movement with the SNP. But it is also worth pointing out that this is no cookie-cutter concept for each devolved country, as Wales, the only other country besides England to vote to leave in the Brexit vote, demonstrates itself more in line with the unionist sentiment, rather than to act as an autonomous Welsh nation when compared to Scotland or even Northern Ireland. Now, this might have to do with Wales's longer legacy of being with England, or just that the Labour Party's dominance of the region has weakened the independence movement in the country. But one example I want to point out as a legacy of this concept of the UK's independent spirit living on, especially in the devolved nations issues, is the example of one of its most pinnacle colonies of freedom, which is the United States of America. Now, this country revolted against the UK in the spirit of seeking freedom. This is the same value that the UK exported in its colonists who settled across the Atlantic back in the colonial era. Now, the US values itself as 50 states of their own autonomous power, that no single federal government is perceived as having the ultimate power over, yet they remain united under the single American identity that reaches from sea to shining sea. So in this way, the autonomous spirit that came from the UK shows itself as a fully functioning method of unity for the United States, as it prides itself on the general concept of freedom as a way of uniting the nation. And thus, the UK seems to find itself at a crossroads of what freedom will mean for their devolved nations, and whether the concept of freedom can be harnessed appropriately to unite the kingdom, or whether freedom just might become too strong of a topic that it could just lead to the possible dissolution of the state, as this just might end up not being tamed by the concept of unity that is also valued in the United Kingdom. So thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.